Well, I was hoping to be there in person today, but I ended up having a bit of a cold, so you might hear me coughing, and this way you can't catch whatever I've got through the screen. So hopefully this will do. So I'm excited to be here with you all and speak towards nutrition and brain health and neuroregeneration and the potential for healing in the brain. Now, what I'm about to say, for some of us, what we eat and our lifestyle can become a huge part of our personal identity. So when we start to question some of our dietary practices or habits, sometimes that can be a little bit stressful. So if you start to feel a little bit stressed out by the information that I'm presenting today, just remember to take a few deep breaths, and you're free to ask questions, and you're free to also just take the information and leave what doesn't serve you. But information and knowledge to me is power. And when we know something, then we can choose whether or not we take that information and change our habits as a result. So hopefully what I'm about to present will be very exciting for a lot of you, because I'm going to bust a few nutrition myths that have been very prevalent in our society for a long time, and talk about and explore in depth why some of the dietary habits a lot of us have in our Western cultures now are accelerating brain aging and causing inflammation and issues towards cognitive function in general. So welcome everybody. Maybe just a little bit about me. My name is Andrea, as you guys know, and I have 3 children, and I've been practicing nutrition and herbalism for, oh gosh, almost 2 decades already. And yeah, so I've been living and breathing nutrition and meal planning and herbal medicine making and teaching for quite a long time now. So it's definitely my passion to talk about food and all things related to how we can enjoy being here together and nourishing ourselves and being in community around food, and how it really brings us together as well. So we know that degenerative changes in the brain at the cellular level can take even 20 years before we ever have symptoms. So that means a lot of the time, by the time we have dementia symptoms or Alzheimer's or other neurological conditions, the issue began a very long time before we actually started to notice our symptoms. So when we think about prevention and what we can do to slow down neurodegeneration and help the brain create new neurons, even as we age and continue to make new connections, because the brain is very, we have a lot of neuroplasticity, and no matter where we are in our age, we can still continue to make new brain cells and new connections with those cells, which is really exciting because there's a lot of potential to help us no matter where we are in our healing process, or no matter what label or diagnosis we've been given. There's a lot of hope for being able to live our best life and still improve whatever our situation is. So for the first half of our lives, we've got about 86 billion neurons. And each of those neurons, which are like single brain cells, each of those can form between 10,000 to 40,000 connections. So there's a lot of information being relayed between all of those billions of neurons. And then as we age, around in our 40s, we start to lose annually a certain number of neurons. And that's just a normal part of the aging process. Some of our connections become lost as well. That's sort of the old adage, if you don't use it, you lose it. So the parts of our mind and our brain that we haven't been practicing or utilizing most often start to be pared back a little bit. But no matter, even when we get to that stage where we start to lose some neurons through the natural process of aging, we still are always able to, like I mentioned, make new neurons and new connections as well. Let's see, where are we here? Sip of water. So there are certain lifestyle factors that can either speed up and accelerate that aging process in the brain and cause a more rapid die-off of brain cells. And there are also lifestyle things and nutrition tips that you can implement that can dramatically slow it down and help you to prevent some of those degenerative neuron situations. It's also interesting to note that many neurologists are talking about an observed trend in vulnerability to head injuries in particular, as far as concussion, especially in sports injury, that we were not seeing in the 70s and 80s or earlier, even though there was inadequate safety equipment, like, you know, the technology for helmets and gear was not up to what it is now, but we had a lot less head injury, which is very interesting. And there's a neurologist named Dr. Peter Cummings, and he wrote a whole controversial book on the subject. It has a very interesting title. I can't remember it. The title is kind of makes you not even really know what the book is about. So it's probably not the best title he chose. But if anyone is interested in sports nutrition, and particularly the sports head injury trauma link, then that book by Dr. Peter Cummings is interesting. But in there, he explores the hypothesis that we have done something fundamentally to our food system and our environment that has made us more prone to neurological issues. And so there's a lot of data to support that, that yes, this is the case. And today we're going to explore some of the factors that are potentially making us more susceptible to brain injury from acute trauma, but also from chronic long-term exposure that can result in age-related degeneration. So one major concern is damage to a structure called actin. Have you guys heard of actin before? Yeah. Some of you are nodding yes. So actin is a primary protein structure within neural environments, both in the cell, so intracellular, and outside of the cell, which is extracellular. And it's responsible for moving resources up and down neurons. So nerve cells are really these long branching cells compared to a lot of other tissue types in the body. And actin is responsible for moving nutrients up and down those neurons. And there's a chemical that's widely used in our agricultural practices and has been since about the 1980s. Its use exploded in the 80s, and that's glyphosate. It's also been known as Roundup. Have you guys all familiar with Roundup? Glyphosate? So it's now sprayed annually in the billions of pounds across the globe. And it's a water-soluble organophosphate. So it's in the same family as Agent Orange and DDT, and those types of chemicals that we have come to think of as knowing to be toxic and poison. But this particular chemical is still in widespread use. It's the most abundantly used agricultural pesticide and herbicide. It's been patented for all sorts of things, including an antibiotic, and its effects on biology are seemingly benign in the short term, unless you are talking to the weeds that it's spraying on, then it's very instantaneous because it robs the plant of its ability to get nutrition from the soil, and then they immediately die. But on human health, there has been a lot of controversy on the safety studies or lack thereof since its introduction. And it's in the family called an organophosphate. So it has been shown to actually disrupt actin structures. So it's almost like a lot of neurologists are calling it the smoking gun, is this link between what's going on with our brain health and our neurological health in our modern age and glyphosate. And so they're calling it out as the smoking gun because we're damaging the structures responsible for protection and adaptation to injury of our neurons. So if you damage those protein structures, you've got, well, you can see the inherent issues in losing your protection. The other big issue with glyphosate, and I say the other big one, there are many, but glyphosate actually weakens tight junctions in the body. So it specifically starts as we ingest it. It gets into our intestines, and then our cells are held together by these little, like they're tight on purpose. We have cells all very close together, and the little spaces in between, like the lines between my fingers here, if you imagine each finger to be a cell, the tight junctions are where nutrients are regulated and wastes are excreted in and out of a cell. But glyphosate, not only is it damaging the actin structures along our neurons, it's actually damaging the tight junctions. And that's, as a water-soluble chemical, it's found now in your blood, in your spinal fluid, in your brain, in your kidneys. That glyphosate is found throughout the body, anywhere that water gets. And it weakens the tight junctions, not only in our intestines, which increases the permeability of things getting into our bloodstream that shouldn't get there, but also into our brains. So you've got the tight junctions that should be keeping things out of the blood-brain barrier. Have you guys all heard of the blood-brain barrier? So it's basically a structure. It's not like a solid barrier, but it's a neuronal and capillary network that is supposed to prevent a lot of substances from getting into the brain that shouldn't. But glyphosate, because it weakens tight junctions, it makes the blood-brain barrier more porous, and a lot of chemicals that should never be able to get into the brain are able to seep in there and further cause inflammation and other issues that we don't want in our brains. So since it is a water-soluble chemical, unfortunately, that's so widespread used in agriculture, it's really hard to get away from it 100%. But we can definitely do ourselves a service by trying to go out of our way to avoid glyphosate exposure whenever possible. And we're going to talk a lot in a minute about grain consumption, because there are other issues with grain consumption when it comes to brain health in high volumes. I would never advocate for cutting out an entire food, but we'll get there in a minute. But glyphosate is primarily used in very, very heavy amounts on grains. They even use it as something called a desiccant. So when your wheat is ready to be harvested, they douse the wheat in glyphosate so that it kills it and it dries faster than if they just cut it down and let it dry in the field. So it speeds the drying, but then you've got this product that's ready for consumption that's been doused in a chemical that's unsafe for human health. And that remains in, they've tested General Mills cereal products, and they have many times over the safety limits allowable for glyphosate, and yet they're still on our shelves. And that is absolutely speeding up the aging process of our brains. Where was I here? Let's make sure I've covered all of that stuff. So there are lots of other chemicals that can also undermine the protein structures in our brain and our nervous systems, and also create inflammation. So it's not just organophosphates and glyphosate, but because of the volume that it is sprayed versus other chemicals, it presents one of the most primary concerns. So other sources of chemicals, your personal hygiene products, looking especially for artificial fragrances and things that tend to have a lot of toxins that can affect your endocrine system, which is your hormone system, and your nervous system. Your cleaning products, also chemicals used in industry like upholstery and clothing. There are lots of fire retardant and various chemicals that can get into us, but largely the biggest source of chemicals that we can most easily avoid are when we focus on what we're eating. So the chemicals used in our food supply is our most regular daily, 3 to 5 times a day, we're putting foods into our mouth that we have a say of what that added burden of toxicity might be. And also, are we giving ourselves the most nutrient-dense food that nourish our body, that lower inflammation in the body and the brain, and that can help prevent and reverse neurological aging? So when we're eating, most of us in our Western culture, especially in Canada and the US, are eating foods that form the bulk of our diets that didn't even exist only a few thousand years ago. And when you talk about the chemicals that are on our food, they didn't even exist, most of them 100 years ago. So we've got literally tens of thousands of various chemicals that our bodies have had to be exposed to with little to no time for adaptation. So our ancestors, we've had 150,000 generations of hunter-gatherer adaptation to build our bodies and our nervous systems and our brains. And we have not had any time to evolve as a species to properly and adequately deal with this onslaught of chemicals that our generations have been exposed to. So that has had its consequences to our nervous systems and our brains. But even the chemicals aside, more than 70% of our diets are coming from foods that our Paleolithic ancestors rarely, if ever, ate. So 4 million years ago, our Australopithecine species forerunner ate meat. And so we come from 150,000 generations of hunter-gatherers. And the result is that we can be here today. We can be giving lectures on the computer that we've invented, and read books and teach and write. And all of that is made possible because humans hunted and ate a lot of fat and protein. And as a result, our bodies became primed and designed to run off nutrient-dense food that animal sources provided. So that helped us actually have a brain that's twice as big as what it should be for a primate our size. And our digestive tracts are actually 60% smaller than they technically should be if you compare other types of primates. So we really are built for nutrient-dense, powerful animal foods. And if you look through all the fossil records and you talk to any paleontologist, across the board, it's unanimous. We know that we developed as a species eating animal foods. So nowadays, because of agriculture, and that is when human health took a massive decline immediately, when the agricultural revolution came into play and we started switching over our diets to more of a grain-based diet versus hunter-gatherer type diet, it immediately shows up in human skeletons for fossil records, in our dental records, and in degenerative and chronic disease in general. So the evidence has been very clear as far as human health goes that agriculture was not so good for our skeletal systems and our bodies in general. We've been filling up on too many empty calories, especially too many simple carbohydrates and sugars. So how many of us can sort of nod our heads that yes, daily we are eating a lot of breads and pastas and crackers and cookies and cakes and things that are really quick and give us that instant satisfaction and that mouthfeel, and we all sort of crave a lot of these foods. Am I right? John's nodding his head no. That's good, John. I'm glad to hear it. So grain-based diets have become a very common thing in our North American cultures, though, and they're even trendy or even promoted as healthful. So, I see as a nutritionist the last, 17 years, there has been a massive trend towards plant-based diets and even veganism at the detriment of people's health. So I do not ever advocate for a vegetarian or vegan diet. Vegetarian, if you can have a lot of proper grass-fed butter and cheese and dairy, then maybe you can compensate. But in a vegan diet, you will see neurological degeneration and skeletal and inflammation and joint problems very quickly. And a lot of it is irreversible if it's been done to the body for a long time. So as a nutritional practitioner, I do not advocate for vegan diets. What I will say is that not all animal products are also created equal. So your animal product should have a 1-to-1 or sometimes a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio of good fats versus more of the fats that can be inflammatory. So that's on animals that are pasture fed. They're eating grass, they're eating plant matter, which their bodies are designed to eat. But when you start to give an herbivore grains, so corn and various things that we're especially genetically engineered corn, which is again sprayed with a lot of glyphosate, you start to disrupt that animal's ecology in their body and they become inflamed, and it changes the constitution of their amino acids and their fats. And then when we eat them, that throws off that ratio. So you end up with animals that have way more uh, omega-6 to omega-3. John, you had a question? You're muted there. Got to push the unmute button at the bottom. There you go.
Okay, thanks. Well, I had two really quick questions. What about, you were talking about the importance of meat. What about, and also talking about vegetarianism and veganism. My question for you is, well, what about fish? Because I'm a pescatarian, so I do eat a lot of fish, and that gives you a lot of protein.
Absolutely.
And but I don't know whether that fits into what is acceptable, just in what you were saying. And then the second thing that I wanted to say, and you can answer them now or answer them later, whatever, is I'm particularly interested in what you were saying about sports injuries in like the 70s and so forth, because that's how I had my brain injury, was a sporting injury as a kid in the 1970s.
Yeah. Concussions definitely happened in the 70s, 80s too, but what neurologists are seeing is a higher trend now where we're seeing severe concussion in higher numbers with even less impact. So I don't have much more other than I can find the book by Dr. Peter Cummings.
I'm sorry, that was the other thing that I wanted to ask for, is if you could, at the end of this program,
find the links for that so you can look him up.
Yeah, or send your links from your lecture, because I'm finding it very
Sure. Yeah, I can send that over to Emma and she can forward it to you guys.
Okay.
So back to the veganism. Yes, fish is an animal protein. So fish is really high in great fats, especially really fatty fish. All seafoods as animal products are really great sources of fats, also iodine and minerals and everything that you want from healthful fats. The only caveat is no farmed fish, because it's the same problem. Farmed fish are eating corn, and corn laced with antibiotics so that they don't die before they have to butcher them. The meat in farm fish is actually gray, and they have to dye it so that it looks palatable. They're very sick animals. So I never advocate for farm fish or factory farmed animals in any way. Animals that are raised on feedlots, that are standing on concrete, they're not exposed to a blade of grass or even sunlight, and they're eating food that they were never designed to eat. So that is not the same thing as having a chicken that is running around eating bugs in the sunlight and able to forage. You know, chickens will hunt down mice, and small animals too, and so it's just very different to have that varied diet that the animal is meant to be eating. It changes the composition of the tissue on their body, and then we eat it. So if we're eating animals that are inflamed and distressed and on medication so they don't die, that affects us very differently than a very healthful animal eating what nature intended it to eat and designed its body to eat. The one thing I have to say about fish consumption that we never had to worry about as much before is because of contamination levels in the oceans and things, there are a higher level of certain heavy metals that are found in particular, especially bottom feeder fish, that we never had to worry about before. So I sort of, give that information and people do with it what they will. If you have a very healthy, intact gut microbiome with very healthy populations of bacteria that are supposed to be there, which we're going to talk more about the microbiome later in this talk, but your microbiome largely protects you from toxins that come in on your food. So they actually act as a buffer, and they can protect you and prevent those heavy metals or other toxins from being absorbed in the body. Unfortunately, because of our high stress, high sugar diets, and the chemicals that are being found in most people's food, a lot of us have microbiomes that are compromised. So we don't have that first line of defense to make sure that those toxins are being dealt with before we have to ever deal with them. So that's a reality of what a lot of us are dealing with, is that our health problems come and stem from a long time of poor eating habits, and just contamination from various sources that have put a strain on the bacterial populations that call us home. So we're basically a planet, and the bacteria inhabit us like a planet. And a lot of us have created ecosystems that are not favorable to our native species anymore. So we have been, as planets, sort of taken over by sugar-loving microbes that don't perform the same biological partnerships and functions for our bodies that the native species would have had we been taking care of our internal planet as our homes. Does that make sense? Little simile or metaphor there. So the biggest issue with grains, especially if grains are the foundation of your diet, meaning that 3 times a day they're the bulk of what you're consuming, is that you're going to be consuming too much starch and sugar. So you'll be overloading your intestines. And when that happens, you get excess fermentation. So you might have bloating and gas or diarrhea and constipation that might alternate. And that ends up causing a lot of inflammation, and it impairs digestion. And at the digestive level, it ends up damaging those tight junctions between the cells. So we've got 2 tennis courts of like a coral reef in our guts. And it's like each cell sort of, our digestive cells are all on the outside of these long hair-like coral reef-like structures called our villi. I was just doing a lung lecture the other day. Cilia and villi are very similar, one in the lungs, one in the digestive tract. So our villi in the intestines are like these protrusions, and all along bacteria live along these, and they take up little seats like musical chairs. And when you get to the underneath those bacteria is our digestive cells called enterocytes, and they're all really tight together. So if you're eating too much starch and sugar and that inflammation is happening and you're feeding the wrong kinds of microbes, what ends up happening is, again, and you're getting glyphosate to compound the issue, but all that inflammation weakens the tight junctions. And then you end up getting undigested or partially digested foods and chemicals and things into the bloodstream that should not have made their way in the bloodstream. And that further contributes to immune responses, more inflammation, and problems down the line. Again, with grains, there's something in grains called lectins. Has anyone read anything about lectins? John's nodding. So lectins are carbohydrate binding proteins, and they can alter the permeability of the gut wall. So again, we do not want our gut to be permeable to anything that the body doesn't decide is a nutrient that it wants and needs. So if it's permeable, that means basically the holes get bigger and things can enter that shouldn't enter. So if lectins are also making the gut wall more permeable, that means there's more inflammation and damage that is occurring. So lectins are found in grains in really high numbers, and over 60% of lectins remain immunologically intact in the digestive tract, even after cooking and going through the stomach and all the digestive processes. So that means that they can cause a lot of destruction still, even when we've taken steps to try to neutralize them. And some of the worst destruction that they trigger is actually autoimmune responses. And that's because some lectins have protein sequences. So proteins are like Lego building blocks, and each amino acid is like a little Lego piece. And as they're built together, they form different proteins in the body. So the amino acid or like Lego sequence that some lectins in grains have are almost identical to human tissues. For example, lectin in wheat is made of an amino acid sequence that mimics both joint cartilage and our myelin sheaths that insulate our neurons. So that's a big problem if you start to react to those wheat amino acids, then your body might also start to attack the neuron sheaths that insulate your nerves, and that can cause neurological issues like MS and various other ones. But that it's interesting to note that with autoimmune disorders in general, people who have celiac disease, so celiacs are actually allergic to gluten. So they have a very serious and dramatic response when any wheat or gluten from any grain is consumed. And it's very interesting because celiacs are 30 times more likely to have schizophrenia than non-celiacs. And numerous clinical studies show that removing gluten from the diet totally ameliorates schizophrenia. So some schizophrenics, they remove gluten and their schizophrenia goes away. So it's very interesting that science is only really just getting the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's been called the gut-brain connection. But there is so much being discovered about what's going on in our digestive system in regards to our neurological health. So a lot of the time, our behavioral challenges or our cognitive challenges are a direct cause of what is going on in our intestines. And when you correct the gut, the brain issue also heals or gets better. Any questions so far about that? Okay, we'll continue on. So we talked about the lectins. So we're going to talk a little bit more about insulin in specifics to grains giving us too much sugar in our diet. So if you're eating a lot of grains, breads, pastas, crackers, all of that breaks down into sugar. That's it. Grains are basically sugar with enough opioids to make us addicted to them. And like, hands up, let's admit how many of us love a good piece of bread or a chocolate chip cookie. It's, they are addicting. It's actually really difficult to completely avoid that stuff in our culture because they're so damn yummy. So most of the deaths in Western countries are from diseases that are directly affected by insulin. So that's things like heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes. All of those are caused by insulin surges that a grain and sugar-based diet actually demands. So if you're eating a high percentage of grains, your body has to respond with surges of insulin to deal with that sugar. Because grains do not give us, they give us a little bit of sometimes mineral and a little bit of inadequate, not optimal protein. But most of the protein in grains is hard to digest. It's not a complete protein. It's not our essential amino acids for the most part. We get a little bit of fiber that's not digested by us, but instead it's digested by microbes. So virtually when we eat grain, all we're getting is a high dose of sugar. Versus when we eat fat and we eat protein, we're getting building blocks that make our body. Our bodies can already make all of the sugar they need if we don't take a single gram of it in from our diet. So we do not need any sugar, but we do need fat and we do need protein. And our brains and our hearts and our main important organs, they run better on fat and protein than they do on sugar. They are more efficient. So it begs the question of why we're giving our body inadequate fuel source as their primary food source instead of giving it the energy sources it actually wants and needs. And so any lecture on fat and especially eating animal fats and things, I always get the question, well, what about cholesterol? Because unfortunately, we've been told for generations now that cholesterol is dangerous and that we should avoid saturated fat and we should be taking cholesterol lowering drugs, which are still the most commonly prescribed medication. And it's becoming increasingly obvious to many, many, many neurologists and other doctors of different modalities as well, that saturated fat not only is And cholesterol is not only not harmful, but it's essential for our brain health. So cholesterol, a little bit about that, it plays a crucial role in all animal bodies because it doesn't dissolve in water. So our internal environment is liquid. So our cell membranes, which make us, they need to be able to be stable, like structurally. So without cholesterol, we would literally be a puddle on the floor. That is what makes us look solid, even though, like, if you actually ask a physicist, we aren't solid. We're energy that's moving, but cholesterol is what gives our cells the ability to maintain a physical structure without just being liquid. It's also, it gives our cell membranes the ability to be waterproof. And that's really especially true of the cells of the nervous system, including the brain. Has anyone here dissected a brain before? Long time ago, maybe? So a brain, if you've ever done any animal processing or hide tanning or any of that, it really is liquid. Like if you tried to hold a brain, it can run right through your fingers. And in a laboratory, they'll actually put it in formaldehyde, so that kind of pickles it and it makes it harder. But in our heads, it really is like a big bowl full of jelly. And our brains are where most of our highest concentration of cholesterol is. And that's on purpose, so that we can maintain our neural structures in the brain. Make sure I got everything I want to talk about there. So there's more cholesterol found in the brain than anywhere else in the body. So cholesterol is our body's basic repair substance. It also has antioxidant powers, and all of our sex hormones are made from it. So it doesn't really sound like such an evil thing, does it? So where do we get it? We get it since our bodies cannot usually synthesize enough of it for optimal health. Animal foods and saturated fat are where we get most of our cholesterol. So things like egg yolks and butter and cheese and animal fats that, you know, from eating the meats that are on it. So your lard or your tallow or your goose fat and poultry and all those things that our bodies, when we eat them, we feel satisfied, and we have taste buds on our tongue that are actually designed to recognize fat. And you can ask, has anyone here tried to be a vegan for any amount of time? No, that's a good thing. But I have talked to so many vegans who it becomes an ideological set, like it becomes part of like their identity as a good human being, and they really make it like more of a philosophical, they cling to this ideology and very rigidly. But what ends up happening is when you avoid fat for so long, your body craves it so bad. So eventually they have these slips. They'll call it slips, as if they've, you know, it's almost like a religious accident, or, you know, then they have to go in and be forgiven of their fat sin, but they'll go on a binge and eat fat, and they can't even control themselves. And then they have, you know, these like guilty feelings that they weren't able to overcome their own innate biology. And that's because fat is so important for our brain health. And we'll talk more about what happens when our body is deprived of cholesterol momentarily, but I just don't want to get off track here from my notes. So infants, if you think about a growing and developing infant, as babies, as humans, we're born very like immature neurologically. We're about 3 months premature when we're born, and breast milk is incredibly high in cholesterol. And it's because a developing baby's brain needs so much of it. So if it was bad, our breast milk definitely wouldn't have so much of it. Our brain is made of 60% saturated fat. And no matter how, like the Framington study that has been going on for decades now, and all these other attempts to try to villainize cholesterol, there has still been actually no scientific connection made between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. In fact, the opposite is being found. It's your sugar consumption that is contributing to the dangerous types of fatty liver. And it's the populations that have the highest saturated fat levels actually have the lowest incidence of heart disease, and people who avoid saturated fat and animal products end up having a higher risk for certain heart disease and issues. So it has definitely been a big industry lie on the part of food manufacturers and salespeople versus science for the last several decades. And we've all been suffering neurologically as a result of that. So you can have your eggs and bacon in the morning and feel good about it and not feel guilty. So not only does animal fat give us cholesterol, it also gives us fat-soluble vitamins. So those are vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K2, and all of those things are crucial for inflammation, like as an anti-inflammatory, and also for healing and repair of tissue. So if you're deficient in vitamin A or vitamin D, you'll see higher levels of inflammation and slower tissue repair. So we need those fat-soluble vitamins for optimal health. How many of you were given cod liver oil when you were young? Awesome. So there's your vitamin A and vitamin D and omega-3 from the fish too. So that was basically the best multivitamin that you ever could have imagined being given to you for your immune system and your cognitive development. Was that good old-fashioned, really horrible tasting cod liver oil. You can still get it, but now they put it in capsules too. So if you don't like the taste and it, scarred you as a small child, choking that down, just get the capsules. It's also the preferred fuel for our hearts. So our hearts want to burn animal fat for fuel. They don't run well on sugar. In fact, if our hearts start to burn sugar, that usually puts us into a acidic state, which makes us more prone to having heart attacks. And we can talk about that a little bit more specifically after. I want to do less heart, more brain, because that's why we're here today. But without fat, our neurotransmitters literally cannot transmit. So if you're deficient in good fats, your nerves are going to have a hard time firing and sending signals to other nerves. So to communicate effectively, you need to have a certain level of saturated animal fats in the body. In the brain, our glial cells provide cholesterol, which allows our synapses to actually form and function. So if you deprive your body of cholesterol foods and then you take cholesterol-lowering drugs, you're actually going to have cognitive impairment at the brain level because your synapses are not able to form and send signals effectively. Low cholesterol also means low serotonin levels, which can mean depression. Cholesterol is essential for the brain's serotonin receptors. So serotonin is really, really important for just being a happy person. And low-fat diets in clinical studies are found to also increase anger, anxiety, and depression. It's actually sort of another, I won't say funny because it's not funny, but it's a known thing that a lot of vegans will be like a hairpin trigger with their anger and their temper. And it's because their brain is literally being deprived of enough fat and serotonin to actually make happy hormones and keep calm and emotionally stable. And like as I mentioned before, animal products, animals that you're eating must also not be eating grain to give you the proper kinds of fat. So eggs from a pasture-raised hen are going to have a 1-to-1 omega-3 to 6 ratio versus 19-to-1 omega-6 to 3 in a grain-fed chicken. So that's a big difference, 1-to-1 versus 19-to-1 ratio. Cows that are pasture-fed are going to have a 3-to-1 to 1-to-1 ratio in their milk products versus 14-to-1 in grain. So again, your heart and brain run 25% more efficiently on ketones than on sugar. And ketones are what the body what you produce when you break down fat and protein for energy versus sugar. Has anyone heard of Weston Price? Nope. Weston Price was a dentist from Canada, and was around, I think, over 100 years ago. And he was very interested in indigenous cultures and their traditional diets and what made them so resilient at first because of their teeth. He found that a lot of indigenous cultures that he would come, and he traveled the whole globe. He was very fascinated by why people in the West had a lot of small jaw structures and a lot of dental cavities and teeth problems in general, and why indigenous cultures who ate their traditional diets had perfect jaw structure, immaculate white teeth that were all straight, completely free of any cavities. It was like they were just immune to having any dental problems. So he actually traveled the globe. He took photos of, like, the very first cameras. He took photos and documented what certain tribes around the world who were untouched by Western civilization at that point, what they ate, and he looked at their physical, like, bone formation. And he also noticed things about, like, chronic disease in general. And these tribes that ate a lot of animal products, like even fermented organ meats and a lot of foods that we wouldn't eat anymore, but they all had that in common, that they ate their base of their diet. They were all, for the most part, hunter-gatherers. And when he noticed what happened to the same tribes, so if a town, say, had split and some had been exposed to Western foods, immediately upon eating grains and sugar, they would start to get cavities, and their offspring would start to develop smaller jaws and teeth crowding and all sorts of things too. And when he endeavored to find any traditional tribe that was eating basically a plant-based diet and still maintaining perfect health, he really wanted to find that, but he couldn't. And all he found was a few that were trying with dramatic failure. So there was, across the board, he could not find a single culture that was eating plant-based and maintaining ideal health. So rage, aggression, being rigid and on a hair trigger, that is the brain of a human deprived of protein and fat, especially tryptophan, which is a precursor for serotonin. And all of your neurotransmitters are made from amino acids, and a lot of them are actually synthesized in the gut by your microbiome. So 90% of your serotonin is actually made for you in the gut by your friendly bacteria that are hopefully living in there. But if they're not, you're not going to have as much serotonin, so you're not going to be as emotionally happy. The other feel-good neurotransmitter are endorphins, and that's our contentment, enjoyment, and also pain-relieving chemicals. And they also need a steady supply of quality protein like eggs, fish, poultry, and cheese. So what happens when you eat a large meal with a lot of sugar, or not a large meal, but a meal with a large amount of sugar, is you get a sugar rush. And what that does is it triggers an adrenaline surge, and that sends endorphins up temporarily. So often, if you are inadequate in protein or serotonin, you'll crave sugar because that's the only time that your body can actually get that endorphin hit, is when you've had that rush of sugar. All right, any questions about cholesterol and saturated fat and things before we move on to another dietary thing that's aging our brains? Okay, so soy. Dr. Lon R. White from Honolulu is a neuro and epidemiologist who studied over 4,000 men and 500 of their wives and found that those who ate tofu at least twice a week had accelerated brain aging, diminished cognitive ability, and were more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. The more soy eaten, the more cognitive impairment and atrophy in the brain they found. Soy isoflavonoids can block tyrosine kinase, which is an enzyme needed by the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is our memory and learning area of the brain. And so the soy isoflavonoids actually block an enzyme needed for memory and learning in the brain. Another soy isoflavonoid is called genistein, and that one is found to interfere with the brain's DNA synthesis by reducing production of new brain neuron cells and increasing cell death. So it is my professional opinion to avoid soy completely unless it is well fermented in a traditional soy sauce as a condiment sparingly. So it should not be the bulk of your protein in your diet. Soy was never used as a food, even in traditional like Asian cultures. They would have a teaspoon to a tablespoon with a meal, and it was always paired by a hearty fish broth or something like that, that would counteract a lot of the nutrient inhibitors that are found in soy. It only became a modern, meal replacement or protein source in the last few decades, and has been heavily industry promoted. It's also another crop that's used, genetically engineered and sprayed with a lot of glyphosate. So not only are you actually getting a product which the isoflavonoids in it are damaging brain function, but you're also getting a walloping dose of chemicals that are weakening your tight junctions and your actin, and making your neurons more susceptible to injury. So avoiding soy is my recommendation. John, are you raising your hand there? You're still muted.
Okay, so in summary, then what you're saying is stay away from soy and also stay away from tofu.
Tofu is made from soy.
Okay, so
Yes.
stay away from both tofu and soy. Thank you.
Yes.
That's all I wanted to know.
Okay.
I'll try not to mute myself all the time, but
okay. That's okay.
Thank you.
It's also interesting to note that a lot of eating disorders are nutritionally, there's nutritional deficiencies at the root of a lot of eating disorders with neurological health. So often there's a major tryptophan and serotonin deficiency and zinc deficiency with disorders such as anorexia and bulimia. So correcting the nutritional deficiency often helps alleviate the issue. And lastly, when it comes to animal products, that is the only way to get your vitamin B12, which is another fat-soluble vitamin. B12 is not found in any actual biologically active state in any animal or any vegetarian foods. So you need animal protein and fat to get your B12 and absorb it. And without B12, you actually can get very rapid brain degeneration. So. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit about the microbiome. I know I touched on it already before, and I likened it to our body being like a planet, and all the little bacteria that live inside of us. There are actually quadrillions of them that call us home. And we get to decide what kind of planet we are based on what we're eating. So we are making an ecosystem in our guts, and that ends up being the garden where the rest of our body will stem from. So the condition of our skin, the condition of our brain and our neurological health, the condition of our circulovascular health and our hearts, that all is going to stem from how well we are able to get nutrition into our bodies and how well we're able to get waste products out. And these little bacteria that call us home perform so many functions, and we're only just discovering all the time what other wonderful miracles they perform for us. So when it comes to our food, they help produce most of the energy that our digestive cells use. They help protect us from pathogen like bacteria and viruses and parasites that might make us sick. They produce substances for us that we actually can directly use as neurotransmitters. They exert some effect on our hormonal systems. They largely help control our stress response. So there's been a lot of research out of places like Russia and out of Europe that your bacterial ecology actually sets your what's the word I'm looking for? Your threshold for stress. So if you've got a really healthy, thriving microbiome, you're going to be better at dealing with stress than if you don't. So those friendly little people or little bacteria citizens that you have inside you are helping your body deal with stress on a physical and emotional level. They actually exert a lot of influence on, especially on our GABA receptors. And GABA is another one of those neurotransmitters that's really important for feeling good. Talked about how they produce serotonin and dopamine. And they interact not only locally with cells in our intestine, but they actually, microbes in our gut actually directly influence our neuroendocrine and metabolic systems. So they're actually directly affecting our brain and every other part of our body through what we're eating. So they're kind of this connection with nature and connection with what's going on outside of us, and they internalize it, and then our body can respond to our outside environment based on what's happening inside of us. So before we go into questions, I just want to talk a little bit about sleep, because sleep is, as we're aging and we're losing neurons, and that process is happening. One of the best ways our body has to actually create new neurons and make new areas in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex specifically is deep sleep. So sleep is super, super, super important. And if you're not sleeping, if you've got stress or you've got pain and you've got issues keeping you up, it's better to focus on the reasons sleep isn't happening versus focusing on the fact you can't sleep. So trying to figure out, okay, are you eating before bed? Are you looking at screens before bed? Are you exercising before bed? These are things that can make it really hard to fall asleep and stay asleep. So we'll go more into that when I do the summary at the end of this. But your stage 3 sleep. So when you sleep, you go through cycles. You go through that stage 1 where you're sort of barely asleep into your phase 2. Your phase 3 is your deep restorative sleep. That's where your growth hormone is released. That's when you do your healing and repairing throughout your body, but especially in your brain. And then you come out into REM sleep. That's your rapid eye movement. That's when it's easy to be woken up again. And then you kind of cycle back and go through all of those stages again several times. Also, so your pituitary, I mentioned during the restorative sleep, your pituitary is releasing your growth hormone, but that's also when your hormones in your body in general are rebalancing. So a lack of sleep actually leads directly to neurodegeneration. Sleep deprivation leads to elevated cortisol extended through the morning, which leads to chronic inflammation. And if you've got chronic inflammation, then that also leads to glucose intolerance and insulin resistance. There's a really fine balance of our glucose, our insulin, our cortisol, and I think I come back to that in a minute. But if you disturb your blood sugar levels or your cortisol, you're going to be affecting all of that stuff directly downstream. So sleep deprivation leads to high levels of something called interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine, and that causes deposition of proteins that can lead to dementia, strokes, and all sorts of other issues in the brain. So even after a single night of poor sleep, there's a protein called beta amyloid that builds up greatly. Now, if you sleep well the next night, then your body can repair and heal from that. But if it becomes a chronic pattern of poor sleep night after night, then you get that buildup of that beta amyloid and those protein depositions in the brain, and that contributes to neurological issues and accelerated brain aging. So to get enough deep sleep, which is your reparative sleep, you need at least 8 hours, and less is going to negatively impact you because you just can't get into that deep sleep enough times. It takes at least 3 hours to get into that deep sleep. So sleep better. You want to make sure to sleep better, you have a sleeping routine. So a regular time you go to bed at night and a regular time you wake up in the morning, as closely as you can. Limit alcohol and caffeine, especially in the evenings. So if you're someone who likes tea or coffee, try to cut yourself off by like, 2 o'clock or 3 p.m. and not have it after, because that can affect your sleep later in the evening. Keep it cold in the bedroom. You'll sleep better if the bedroom is cooler. No screens 2 hours before bed. That blue light actually affects your melatonin and your hormones that help you fall asleep. So if you know you're going to go to bed at 10, try not to have any screens after 8 o'clock p.m. Also, when you exercise in the morning. That's going to give you all those. When you exercise, you release a lot of excitatory neurotransmitters and hormones and things. And so if you're exercising right before bed, it can make it difficult to fall asleep. Your nutrition, again, we just talked all about getting the right amounts of fats and proteins, fat soluble vitamins and things. That's going to impact your ability to have proper neural connections and be able to have a healthy sleep. Also, don't eat before you go to bed. If you eat before bed, especially if it's a higher sugar meal, that's going to send your glucose levels going right up. And we're talking about that highly regulated system of growth hormone, cortisol, glucose, and insulin. So if you have a carb dump right before bed, it's going to prevent any fat burning. And your brain wants to burn on lactate and fat. It doesn't want to burn glucose, but it will if you've just given it a whole bunch and then been inactive, because you can't burn, nothing else can use glucose so much when you're sleeping. Your brain's going to be doing it. And the other thing that's really important for actually sleeping, and people don't consider it, is being well hydrated. So making sure that you're drinking enough water throughout the day actually helps you sleep better. Yes, John.
I'm on mute.
Oh, no, you're not on mute. You're good. I can hear you.
Well, what though if you're on fluid restrictions? Like I'm on fluid restrictions because of the condition I have, and so I can only have like max 1 liter of fluids per day.
Yeah.
That's very little fluids.
Yeah.
But what you're saying though about the best part of it, of your health being having lots of fluids.
Well, I wouldn't say the best, but it's really important to be hydrated, because your cells it's like if you imagine a river that's really full of water, and where that water is free moving. And in the heat of the summer, sometimes those creeks and rivers kind of turn into like the sludgy mud going through. And so the channels of delivering nutrients and waste can sort of, it's harder for your body to deliver nutrients and get waste away if you're dehydrated. It also puts more strain on your heart. So it's a conversation to have with your doctor. I definitely can't talk about specific medications and your condition. I'm just out of my realm of practice, and it's out of my area of expertise specific to your condition. But is that something that is that I would ask my doctor if it's something that's a short term, or if it's something that's a forever thing, or how we can work with that to make sure that you're getting the hydration that you need in balance that's safe for you.
Okay. And I'll let other people ask whatever questions they've got, and I do have several other questions after other people have.
Sure. So that's what I've got for today, as far as talking about what we can do on a daily basis, which is, to sum up, on a daily basis, make sure that you're eating enough animal fat and protein and vegetables that are preferably non-starchy to form that fiber and that other bulk of what you want to eat. Avoiding excess grains and sugars, so that's not your foundation of your diet. You can still have some bread and the occasional pasta or things. Just make sure that it's in balance, that you've got enough fat and protein and other things in your diet as well to balance that out. The bread is like the catalyst for the butter. That's the thing you can put the butter on. It's not as much fun just to eat a slab of butter by itself, but and then making sure you're getting adequate hydration, adequate sleep, and trying to buy organic or at least unsprayed food wherever you can, so that you're avoiding glyphosate and other chemicals that can be accelerating inflammation and brain aging. And also avoiding soy, And I think that's what we covered.
And tofu.
Yes, soy is tofu, yes.
All right, may I ask another question then? Is it okay if I
Yes.
ask a couple of questions? First, are you familiar with Dr. Robert Lustig?
No.
Okay, he wrote a book, and it's also on University of California TV, and it's uctv.tv. And he wrote a book, and he also did a university lecture on this, and it's called Sugar colon the Bitter Truth.
Okay.
And it talks all about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people are now in the medical community calling Alzheimer's basically type 3 diabetes, because it is a problem with, the brain getting fuel with sugar. Also, I don't know, see if I can find it. I might have missed a page. I think I had something about specifically concussion and sport injury with sugar in here to go over. You can ask a question. I'll see if I can find it.
Okay. Well, first, I'll tell you just so you understand. My sports injury was I was a spectator at a professional baseball game, and I was hit with a line drive foul ball.
Wow.
And had to have 3 brain surgeries and all that. But at any rate, I would recommend you even looking up on uctv.tv about this Robert Lustig book. He's written several.
Can you spell his last name?
Yeah, Lustig, and
Okay.
And he's a doctor, I think, out of San Francisco, who's either with ECSF. Yeah, I think that's where it was. And he dealt mainly with children. But anyway, and he's also written several books. And you mentioned about cod liver oil, right?
Yes.
And I do take fish oil. Is it all right to add some cod liver oil to the fish oil tablets that I've got, so it gives me more omegas?
Yeah, the cod liver oil specifically, you're getting, I recommend getting the fermented one, because the modern way of making cod liver oil, they get the oil, but then they put it through molecular distillation, which is a heavily mechanical and kind of chemical sometimes process. And in that process of trying to clean the oil, it strips all the real vitamin A and all the real vitamin D out, and then they put synthetics back in. So if you get the fermented cod liver oil, it's still traditionally made, and it still traditionally tastes terrible, and it has all the real vitamin A and all the real vitamin D in it. And that's the reason for it. It's not so much the omega-3, although you get that. It's the vitamin A and vitamin D.
Okay, I'm just writing this down.
Yes.
And I just very quickly wrote down some things, and I won't bore you with them, but I just want to make sure that I'm. Okay.
It's hilarious.
Sorry, the one other question I had.
Sure.
Was, you said that 90% of serotonin comes from the gut, I think?
90% of our serotonin is produced in the gut from our friendly bacteria.
Okay, and that's something that's very important, is what you're saying.
Extremely important. Actually, I found one more page, although I still can't find where I wrote down about the Gatorade and concussions and why that was the worst thing to give someone with a concussion. But I'll just go through these notes quickly here, because it brings up the microbiome a bit more again. So that's so funny. I feel like I'm missing a big chunk of my notes suddenly. Anyways, so when the body is in an elevated adrenaline and cortisol, it cannot function optimally or restore itself. So this actually shrinks brain volume and shrinks the hippocampus, which is the area essential for learning and memory. So if you are doing anything throughout the day that chronically elevates your stress hormones, and that's your cortisol, adrenaline, you're going to be shrinking your hippocampus and your prefrontal cortex. So when we talked about the high levels of grain consumption, when you have a high level of grain consumption in the body, you end up getting that huge spike in insulin because your sugars go up and then your insulin goes up. And then that's an emergency to the body, right? Because like if you have too high blood sugar, that's a life or death thing. So you have a surge of your stress hormones and the insulin comes and it cleans it up. But now there's usually something called reactive hypoglycemia. So your blood sugar goes up and then it crashes. So if this is the normal line, it goes up and then crashes and goes actually below the normal line. So now low blood sugar is actually also a life or death emergency for the body. And when you're below there, now your body again sends out stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And that works with some other hormones in your body to release more sugars from stored areas in the body so that you can bring your blood sugar back. But whenever you're releasing that cortisol and adrenaline, that's like basically our nervous systems have been designed over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years to be in the days where we were hunter and gatherers and life was pretty peaceful. And as we were gathering, oh no, there's a tiger. And that's when our adrenaline would kick in because we have to think about this tiger attack. So a high sugar, high carbohydrate diet is like a tiger attack 3 times a day on the body. And that's, you know, breakfast should not be one of those life-threatening scenarios. So in our modern lives, most of us have stress and it's unavoidable, but we can do things to bring ourselves back into parasympathetic activity. And that's our rest, digest, calming area of the nervous system. So that's things like exercise and meditation and diaphoretic breathing, time in nature. All of those things can help us calm our nervous systems back down. But
this is the stress.
Yeah, so that's stress. But physically, what you're eating and doing to your body is still a form of stress. So there's our emotional perceived stress, and there's our physical stress, and then there's mechanical stress. There's all sorts of different forms of stress. But whatever is causing that adrenaline and cortisol is going to be affecting our brain. So anytime we can reduce our stress hormones, the better for our brain.
Right.
So stress is actually what accelerates the brain aging. And then we talked about deep sleep, and that restores the volume of the hippocampus and restores those connections that we might have been losing. And also the actin. So if the glyphosate is breaking down the actin, what we can focus on to restore that is actually the microbiome, because now it's really exciting. We actually know that our cells are communicating with our own human cells because of the microbiome. So it's because of those bacteria that live inside us that our cells can even communicate the way that they do. So there's even sort of this mind-blowing new research coming out about human consciousness and how largely that might be because of our microbiome as well. So even neurologists, sort of at the end of their career, they've been around a while, they're all sort of unanimously admitting a spiritual overlay that when we die, and some of them had near-death experiences themselves now, when the human body dies, the consciousness remains. It's like there's that spiritual level. It's like our mind is not in our brain any more than it's in our little finger. But there's a lot of research now coming out that there might be something to our own consciousness and the microbiome, which is really interesting because we actually are more microbe than we are human cells when we think of our body as an organism. So whenever you benefit your microbiome, you benefit your neuronal structures and your ability for the body to adapt and communicate at a cellular level. And
if you can send this like to Emma or somehow, I would very much appreciate going through it and over it again.
Emma, you recorded this, right?
Yeah, I am. I've recorded it, John. So I was planning on maybe doing up a little cheat sheet for you guys of just an overview of what Andrea's talked about so that you can go back and look at it. So I know it's a lot of good information, but it's hard to retain it all at once. So
It reminds me of university, unfortunately.
yeah.
You're trying to write down the highlights, but everything's a highlight.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing too is if you guys have questions later that you want to ask Andrea that you haven't thought of right now, I can send them her way too to get for her to answer for you guys.
Yeah.
That
I
would-
like to go into sort of the science behind it, but if that's too much, just remembering the basics of like, okay, avoiding soy, eat my good protein and fat, try to not get glyphosate exposure, those sort of keys. And then if you want to know the deeper reasons why, then you can come back and watch this again or go through and do some more research and learning. But at least knowing the principles, it's there.
Do carbs fall into the bad fats sort of area?
Carbs?
Yeah.
So carbs are sugar. So if you're talking about macromolecules, you've got carbohydrates, which gets shortened to carb. So it's just carb is carbohydrate, and then protein and fat. So your carbs are just sugar. And there are vegetables that are really starchy, and those are high in carbs. So your potatoes, your sweet potatoes, your yams, tropical fruits, those will be higher in carbohydrates versus your non-starchy vegetables, which would be like your cruciferous vegetables, your leafy greens, your carrots. Those things have less sugar. So you can have ample volume of those vegetables and not affect your blood sugar.
Okay, well, as soon as Emma sends them back, I'm going to be going through it again. Thank you.
Right on, John.
Thank you very
Are there
much.
any other questions? Bev? It's okay.
In this recording, Emma, are you going to send a link?
Yeah, I can send it to you guys if you want, and you can rewatch it.
Yeah,
that
would be nice.
Definitely, I will do that for you guys.
Because it was very good, Andrea, but it was a lot of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Taking the notes.
Any other questions for Andrea before we let her go?
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe before we go, does everyone want to go, like totally optional, but maybe just talk about the one thing in there that you sort of were able to reflect and go, hey, that's something I can add, or that's something I can change, or something that interested you about this lecture, if it's just even one thing that you were able to take away?
I really like hearing the stuff that was related to me being a pescatarian. That I'm not a meat eater or beef eater, but I'm not either a vegetarian. So I didn't understand all of that, how much you could get in the way of protein and some of the other vitamins that you mentioned. Thank you.
Bev, you want to go next?
It was just one thing. The fact, like I have a lot of celiacs in my family, and people who eat are vegans, and so it's when my family tried to tell me I'm a celiac too, because it's in the family, And I went and had the biopsy of my stomach to prove it, because I'm a scientific mind, and I didn't have it. But anyways, it's all very interesting, and all of our bodies are unique and stuff. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And it's true, our bodies are so biochemically unique, but also unique because of our microbiome. You will never find two people who have the exact species of microbiome. So that's why I'm not really a fan of probiotics. I'm a fan of getting probiotic rich food. So your food has live cultures. So things like fermented sauerkraut and kimchi, and I make fermented pickles. They taste like dill pickles, but instead of being made with vinegar, they're actually fermented and they're full of live bacteria. So anytime that you can get your bacteria from your food, bacteria actually directly communicates from your food bacteria to what your resident bacteria are. And there's this exchange that happens, and an intelligence that is there, basically informing your body what is going on around through the foods you're eating. So by eating, we are engaging in the intelligence of nature. So it's a pretty beautiful process when you think of it.
Yeah.
Barbara, did you want to share your one thing that stood out to you?
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. And again, Andrea, have you read how the gut is considered to be our second brain? Between that or the heart, which we do. But I think the heart rules above all. Heart, brain, gut. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Wendy, did you want to share something?
I was particularly interested how Andrea said not to eat late. I eat late all the time. And it just calms me before bed. It calms me, I find, for my anxiety. So she said not to eat late.
Yes,
What would be the cutoff time? What would be the cutoff time?
Well, I would generally say, like, even if you can, start with 1 hour before bed. If it's something that you do right before bed, just bring it back slowly, and don't make it, a sudden 4-hour thing, because that might be, especially if you're dealing with anxiety, that might be too much. But if you slowly bring it back by 20 minutes or 30-minute increments until you can get to the point where you have dinner at like 6 or 6:30 or maybe 7, and then you don't eat again. You can have water or tea, like herbal teas, but not to have a large meal before bed. Because though, especially if it's carbohydrate that you're reaching for before bed, those opioids in the grains actually they make us feel good. They're calming, but it's a temporary calm, and we trade it for the downstream effects later that can actually exacerbate anxiety and other issues. One last thing about grains, you might not have celiac, but if you've got trouble digesting, especially with the stomach acid. So I did miss there's a piece of my notes missing. I know there is, because the other part about eating a lot of grain, when your adrenaline surges, if that happens a lot, that will actually shut down your stomach acid production. And if you shut down your hydrochloric acid, you will not digest anything properly, but especially not your protein digestion. And so if you're chronically having adrenaline and cortisol to the point where your stomach acid gets shut down, now you're going to be having acid reflux, which is also called heartburn, and all sorts of other digestive issues occurring. And one of the first things we have to do is to make sure that the stomach acid production is back up, because it's like the person in the factory if there's an assembly line, say, producing a toy, it's like someone sticking the head on the butt of a toy. No one else in the assembly line can fix it because the guy at the beginning messed up. So you need to have your stomach acid to activate proper protein digestion. Now, the hydrochloric acid performs several functions, including killing off unfavorable microbes and things that could be on your food. But if your protein digestion is messed up, then what can happen is you get this sticky, undigested protein mass that ends up in your small intestine. And you can actually have things called gluteomorphines that are produced. And there are other things that can get produced, and that can directly affect your brain activity. So a lot of children who have ADHD or anxiety or behavioral issues, but adults too, we just become a little better at regulating ourselves. It's actually directly related to inability to properly digest certain proteins, and then those proteins become toxic and affect the brain, because our digestive tract is like one cell thick, and there's that vagus nerve that connects the gut and the brain, and there's a direct feedback between the chemicals in our gut and what's reaching our brain. And that's why when we have neurological things and our doctor prescribes us something, he doesn't inject our brain, he gives us a pill and it goes in our gut. So we know that what's in the gut affects the brain. And without taking any medication, your body's own intrinsically produced chemicals end up affecting our neurological health.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kathy, did you want to share anything?
On the gut and the inflammatory things that you mentioned, they were very interesting.
Okay.
And I thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
And Glenn, did you want to share anything?
I'm interested in your take on vegetarianism and veganism. I never knew of any negative aspects to it before.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Andrea. That was awesome. I think we're just about at 11:30. So if anyone has any other questions, or we will just see you guys next week.
Yeah.
Great. Can you send it to me, the recording to me too, please, Emma?
Yes, for sure I will.
Great. Thank
Okay,
you.
awesome.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
I see you at 1.
See you at 1, Bev. Yeah.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Thanks so
Bye.
much,
Bye.
everyone.
I know.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.